We've seen some strange ideas set forth as blessed or happy in the Beatitudes thus far. And now this final one is no less surprising. In fact, it sounds almost absurd, perhaps even a cruel mockery, for it goes on to tell us to rejoice and be glad in the face of persecution and suffering. So, live a righteous life, expect to suffer for it, and be happy about it? And isn't it peculiar that this beatitude follows immediately after those that talk about the pure in heart and the peacemakers? Why would such as those be the ones to pay such a heavy price in terms of persecution and suffering? And by the way, we know that some of those followers of Jesus who were present when he first gave this message, they ended up even paying with their lives for their devotion to him. Well, it's a tough one, and to try to think about it, I'm at a very interesting place. Let me show you this. Across the valley over there, beyond the old Jerusalem city wall, is the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus was arrested at the Garden of Gethsemane. He was taken this short distance to where we are now, and then brought up these steps where we're approaching at the moment. These are said to be the very steps where they took Jesus after he was arrested to appear before the chief priest Caiaphas at his palace. At the top, we enter the holding cell in the basement where the prisoners were detained. I've sometimes thought of cancer as a prison sentence or a death sentence, but in this prison I could only think of the supreme irony of Jesus locked up here beneath the earth, the one who had gone about bringing life, healing, freedom, and deliverance, is now held captive and persecuted by jealous and self-righteous men. But for now, we're not going to get into the matter of persecution directly. We'll look instead at a related sub-theme, that of unjust suffering. It's an issue people with cancer often face. We ask, why did this happen to me? What did I do? Am I being punished? How unfair that I get this tragic disease when others who live far worse lives, they seem to get off untouched. So what about unjust suffering? How can God allow it? This might be the oldest, biggest, nastiest question in the world. And how concerned we get about God's reputation. We struggle to find excuses for God. We feel we need to get him off the hook, as it were. But recall how in the greatest story on suffering ever written, that of Job in the Old Testament, there's no final answer or explanation given. And Job was a righteous man. He didn't suffer because he was bad. The story indicates he suffered because he was good. And Job didn't deserve to lose all his family, his business, his possessions, his health, the support of his friends. In the story, it's quite clear that while God did not send the tremendous tragedies that piled in on him, at the same time, God wasn't taken by surprise either. In fact, God even allowed it. But in the end, God worked through it, restored Job, and turned his life into far more than it was at the beginning. He showed Job a much larger picture, one that was impossible to see in the midst of the turmoil. In other words, there was a story behind the story. And we too are caught up in a much larger story in which our present and our immediate experience are only a small part. As one dear friend wrote to me, if you were able to see what God sees and see it in the larger picture in which he is working, you would choose exactly what has been happening to you. While we may never get full understanding or answers in this life, we can find something even more important, and that's the presence of God. He comes to our side so that even though the circumstances of the moment may seem unbearable, His presence will carry us through. In the midst of it all, there is given His promise of the kingdom of God. That's the time and place when the Lord will rule and all things will be put right. But how could Jesus tell us to rejoice in the midst of pain and persecution? It seems so contrary to all we would expect. And surely it's different for each individual who faces such testing. But I find help in the writing of two of my heroes from history. In the 2nd century, Justin was a young philosopher who became a follower of Christ. Persecution against Christians was intense, and Justin wrote his first apology, or defense of the faith. He wrote it to the Emperor Antonius Pius. There, Justin set forth his amazing convictions and confidence and sent it to the most powerful man in the world at the time. He said to the emperor, "You can kill us, but you cannot hurt us." Justin was beheaded in the year 165 AD, but he knew his life and the well-being of the church was so secure in the ultimate purposes of God and His kingdom that they did not need to fear even the might of the Roman Empire and the prospect of death. Or hear Albert Delp, a pastor in Munich, Germany. He spoke out against the Nazi regime. He was arrested, tortured, imprisoned, and then executed February 2nd, 1945, tragically just weeks before the end of the war. In the weeks before his death, he testified through his journal, smuggled out of prison, these amazing words: "It does happen, even under these circumstances, that every now and then my whole being is flooded with pulsating life, and my heart can scarcely contain the delirious joy that is in it. Suddenly, without any cause that I can perceive, without knowing why or by what right, my spirits soar again, and there's not a doubt in my mind that all the promises hold good. Outwardly, nothing has changed. The hopelessness of the situation remains only too obvious, yet one can face it undismayed. One is content to leave everything in God's hands, and that is the whole point. Happiness in this life is inextricably mixed with God." In the lives of both Justin Martyr and Albert Delp, we see tranquility and joy even in the midst of unjust suffering. Our final beatitude assures us that even in the most difficult situations, blessedness may still be found. Their testimonies show how they already could taste what's promised in the Beatitude, that theirs is the kingdom of God. Now, in our final segment, we'll look at a key ingredient for anyone or everyone eager to find that same blessedness.